Good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you for coming to see. Seated. As many of you probably know, I give plenty of these introductions. And while they are all important, this one has some particular meaning to me. And it's not just because I've been a fan of Erick since following him on RedState for a long time. And it's not just because I followed him for years as he appeared on Fox News, which is on in my office, it seems, 24/7. And it's not just because of what I always find is his truly insightful commentary on the reservation.com, a blog that I turn to often. Rather, this introduction is special to me because of something else we share in common. To wit, here's a quote from a blog post that Erick wrote some time ago for Fox News. I quote Erick. He says, "I have to tell you that American politics really does not matter when you have kids and are dying. You begin to seriously ask yourself what you want your kids to know if you're gone." Close quote. Well, for those of you who know me somewhat, you may know that I've been battling an illness of my own for about 5 years now. And some know that there were a few times that I haven't been able to make it into the office or host events like this as a result. And some of you might even see my kids here at the library from time to time, time that I ensured I could spend every moment with them while I could. What you may not know, however, is that I am now hopefully in remission. I bring this up only to properly introduce Erick in his new book entitled Before You Wake. In April of 2016, with his blood oxygen level below 90%, doctors rushed Erick into a cardiac intensive care unit, and they discovered he had blood clots in his lungs. So as he lay in a CT machine waiting to get scanned at the Mayo Clinic, they called his wife to inform her that doctors thought she had lung cancer. So 6 months later, they confirmed she has a genetic incurable form of a disease. And as Erick said in the New York Times at the time, our family life is now focused on 3-month windows of normalcy between CT scans. I know that feeling. Not surprisingly, last November, Erick found himself posting an essay on the web relating the things he would want his children to know if their mother and he died before they woke. I understand that feeling and have lived that feeling. Of course, thankfully, my wife is very healthy, but I cannot even imagine how it must feel to have both parents sick at one time. Well, a publisher later asked Erick to turn his essay into a book of letters for his children. He's here today to discuss and sign copies of that book, one of the most thoughtful and heartfelt books I've had the privilege of reading. So, Erick, I will continue to keep you and your wife in mind and in our prayers, as I'm sure everyone here today will continue to do so as well. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library, Mr. Erick Erickson.
Thank you all for coming. I'm always phobic about how many people will show up, particularly in weather like this. And I feel like I have to apologize because when this was last scheduled, you had the fires. And now this is scheduled, and you have the rain and the floods. So I don't want to say that it's me, but every time I've been in California in the last 6 months, it's rained or burned. So anyway, thank you all for having me. Thank you to the Reagan Library and the Foundation for having me. I live a very blessed life. I grew up in Dubai in the 1980s when Dubai was not the Dubai you know now. My dad worked for an oil company, and in 1980, his company basically told him, move to Dubai or find a new job. So we moved. The benefit of that being in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president. The world seemed like a safer, saner place. And Americans, by and large, could go everywhere other than behind the Iron Curtain for the most part. And in Dubai, your visa had to be renewed every 3 months. And so my family would pack up for a week. My dad's company would say, pick a country, and we'd go. All expenses paid. I've still been to more countries than states. We came back to the United States for 10th grade. I will never forget. People think I make this story up, and it is the God's honest truth. I started out at a private school about 30 minutes from our house. And then the Gulf War broke out. That was one of the reasons all the American families had to come home. And we were driving back and forth 30 minutes each way to go to this private Christian school in rural Mississippi because the public schools in our area weren't great in Louisiana. And then the Gulf War started and gas got up to the outrageous price of $1.25. And my parents decided it was time to go to public school. And my very first day in 10th grade, English class, the teacher's name was Linda Priest, and a guy raised his hand in class with me and asked, he did not recognize a word, Liberty. And the teacher looked at him just incredulously, really did. And she said, liberty, and he nodded, and I knew it was a culture shock. It was a real culture shock to come back to the United States, which I still to this day consider the greatest country on earth. And in a 10th grade class in rural Louisiana, there was someone who didn't know that word, which to this day fascinates me. We also, as an aside, thought that the United States was the greatest country on earth when we came back because the weekend in Dubai was Friday and Saturday. The Sabbath was on a Friday, so you went to school Sunday through Thursday. And we get back to the United States, and you have 3-day weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Until the school called wanting to know why we were consistently out on Fridays. My parents grew up in this country. They should have known, but they forgot, I guess. I moved to Macon, Georgia to go to college in 1993. My wife's roommate and my roommate were engaged. My roommate decided he was gay and transferred. And my wife and I stayed in touch, and we got married. In our first 3 months of marriage, my wife has a terrible cancer history in her family, breast cancer. Every woman essentially in 4 generations has had breast cancer in her family. So 3 months after we got married, she had a prophylactic mastectomy. We found out 2 weeks ago through genetic testing, she's actually the one person in her family that doesn't have the breast cancer gene. But hey, she got the lung cancer one. So she gets the mastectomy, and we put off having kids. We got married at 25. I was right out of law school. We essentially got to be able to know each other as husband and wife for 5 years before we had kids. And I'll never forget, about a year after we had our first child, actually it was a year after we had our first child, in October of 2006, we were headed off to the beach for a week. The great thing with small kids that I didn't appreciate until they got into school was that you used to be able to go to vacation any time of year. And then they go to school and you're confined to 3 months during the summer when everyone else is as well. So we would take vacation in October with my wife's parents, but she called me and she said, I think I'm dying. You need to come get me. She sounded like she was dying. And so I rushed off. She was the assistant to the president of my alma mater, Mercer University, and went to get her, took her to the university president's doctor who said she either has a gallbladder or a pulmonary embolism. Ironies abound here. And scan her lungs. If they don't find the embolism, it's the gallbladder, but the gallbladder presents as all sorts of things, and so we think it's gallbladder butt. So they scan her lungs. She doesn't have a pulmonary embolism. She has a gallbladder attack, and they said, we did find some spots in your lungs, but don't worry about it. Everything looks okay. Just get them checked later. So off we went to the beach, where 24 hours later she was having emergency surgery because of a blocked bile duct that they did not pick up. Interestingly enough, when we got back from vacation a week later after she had recovered, there was a message on the answering machine from the emergency room asking if we could give them a call. They had found something else. But like, she got to vacation like a rich person and recover at the beach while I took care of the kid. We were living off her parents at the time pretty much, so it was a great vacation in that regard. But she did go back to follow up on the lung scan, and when they looked at her lungs, they said, well, your lungs look okay. There are these spots. They don't look cancerous, but we found a blood clot in your jugular vein, which, if you know anything about the blood flow, you don't get clots in your jugular vein. The blood flow is too high. So I remember she came home, she was ghost white. She says, I have to go to the hospital. So she went to the hospital, and the doctors looked at the scan, and they said, there's this really weird form of cancer, and one of the signs that you have it is you have these blood clots, and they can get even in places like your jugular vein. We probably need to biopsy your lungs. So a lung biopsy is apparently the worst possible thing ever. They had to go in through her back, take a sample of her tissue, and like a scene from a movie, they call and they bring her parents and me into a small windowless room in the back of the hospital, and on a windowless corridor. In a little bitty room, there's a Bible, a phone, and 2 chairs. And the doctor stands, I sit, her mom sits, her dad stands, and he informs us that she has a very rare form of cancer. It is a cancer that has not originated in her lungs. She has 6 months to live. And all I can think is, I've got to go pick up my kid from daycare. I have 30 minutes to get there, or they're going to charge me extra. I really try not to process this. And go pick up Evelyn, who was 1 at the time, make it home. It has started raining. And I get Evelyn out of our car, and I can't move any further. Sit in the mud, it's pouring down rain, crying that I am a new dad, 1-year-old child, and this is it. We've got 6 months. And so get my child in, get her down for a nap, and wait for other family to come take over so I can go back to the hospital. And my wife and I have this wonderful conversation this night in the hospital about what life would look like after this. Now, she, you should know, did not believe this diagnosis. She felt fine. So like, there's no way I have cancer that spread to my lungs and I have 6 months to live. I feel great, other than someone just cut me open and took out a piece of my lung. So she refused to believe it. And we're in the hospital, and she says, when I'm gone, she said, well, if I'm gone, your job is a catapult. She said, this is what you've always done. When I was a lawyer, when I did indigent criminal defense, it was always finding people and ideas and catapulting them somewhere where they can get attention for other people to look at. I made the mistake one time of putting myself on the catapult and getting elected to city council, which is the worst job ever. People yell at you in the grocery store when their trash is not picked up. Worst job ever. I was spared because I got a radio job and was able to get out of the job by resigning 6 months early. My radio show wouldn't let me keep the job if I wanted a radio show, in any event. So my wife is telling me this, and it's kind of clicking with, this is kind of my career. And this is what I've been doing. And we wrap up this conversation. We also decide that we're in a church where we're the youngest people by 40 years. We have the only child in the church. It's time to go find a church with people our age. We have been shepherded along by people who were older than us who had great advice. It's time to put me somewhere where potentially I could find single women at some point, and also a place for a child. We wrap up this conversation near midnight, and the doctor came in and said, we misdiagnosed your wife. She had a very rare condition that they had never seen before. They were pretty sure it was benign. They were sending it to the Mayo Clinic to get examined. And the Mayo Clinic said, it's these benign nodules in my wife's lungs. Don't worry about it. Everything's fine. So we lived a very happy life until, this guy named Donald ran for president. I was not a supporter of the president's when he ran for office. I wasn't a supporter of the other side. I just kind of tapped out in 2016. The world was on fire, and I would just bunker down and wait for the wildfire to burn out and help rebuild society when it was over. And along the way, odd things happened. I wrote in February of 2016 on a book tour, no less, kind of killed the book tour, that I just didn't think I could support this guy. And it kind of sent my career spiraling. And through that time, as all bad stories begin, I had gone to a CrossFit gym and decided I needed to get myself back in shape. And I had just turned 40 and was having trouble. I mean, I was out of shape and I knew it, and I was struggling for breath. And it got worse and worse and worse, and finally, like, I'm too old for CrossFit, which all my friends were saying, no, you're not. You just need to eat better, give up the beer and pizza diet, and you'll be fine. I did give up the beer and pizza diet temporarily, and it didn't improve. It got worse and worse and worse. And finally, I literally was crawling up the stairs at night to put my kids in bed and would have to sit there. And my wife's like, this is ridiculous. You have to go to the doctor. And I wasn't going to the doctor. I was a 40-year-old man and in good health who just crawled upstairs because he couldn't walk. There's otherwise nothing wrong with me. And so she actually called my doctor without me knowing, scheduled me to go see a cardiologist without me knowing, woke me up early one morning, literally told me I was getting in the car or else, drove me to a doctor who turned around and sent me to a hospital to get a CT scan. So I go in and I wait and I wait and I wait and I wait, and literally they're laying me on the bed, and my wife is trying to call me at the time, which she can't get me because you're in the CT room and yes, your cell phones don't work. So when they get me out, I'll never forget. You know, the technicians at hospitals are not actually allowed to tell you what they've seen. That's for the doctor. If you bribe them, maybe they will. But this poor kid comes out and he's whiter than the lab coat he's wearing. And he yells back into the room and says, should I strap him down? And I just chuckled and said, so it's that bad. And I started to get up from the machine, and he puts his hand on me and he pushes me and he pushes down and he says, don't move, you should be dead. And it's like, oh. Now, the irony in this story is actually that they couldn't immediately get me into a room, and so they had me in a wheelchair parked in the hallway, and I was so tired of sitting in the wheelchair, I got up and walked off. And so you have half the staff in the hospital running around trying to find a guy who's supposed to be dead, and they finally find me in the lobby talking to my wife, where she informs me the Mayo Clinic had just called and told her they think she might actually have lung cancer, that she needed to come in for an exam and fly to Arizona to have an exam. So I'm getting in the hospital and trying to book her and her dad a flight to Arizona because I knew I probably wouldn't be able to be on an airplane. Get into the hospital room, and I'll never forget this. So I'm in the cardiac ICU unit. I can see out to the nurses' station. They have scans up, and there's one scan they're all standing around looking at. And the doctor comes by. It's right outside my room, and he points at it and says, have y'all taken that body to the morgue yet? And they all turn around and look at me like, this really is serious. They come in and they inject me with the TPA agent they give stroke victims. And the CT tech had ruptured a vein in my arm. And I'll never forget, they put that medicine in, and this welt spreads out on my arm, and this bruise forms literally from the tip of this finger to here. I'm black. And there's nothing they can do about it. And they informed me that I had more than 24 blood clots in my lungs, and 3 are supposed to kill you. And they think that it was probably a very large blood clot that had shattered and had fragmented in my lungs. I still have pieces of it. And I was in a hospital for a week. And my wife was flying to Arizona to be told that she had lung cancer. 6 months later, they actually did confirm for her. She has a very rare form of lung cancer. There's no cure for it. She's on a tiny little pill that will last her for about 2 years before her cancer mutates, and then she'll have to find another pill, and then another one 2 years after that. They've luckily got the next pill, so we have at least 2 to 3 more good years. But we're dealing with all of this in the campaign 2016, and then we have protesters show up on our front porch to inform me that if I wasn't going to support the president, since I was supposedly a conservative, they were going to ensure that my life was ruined. They weren't going to kill me. They were just going to make sure that I lost all of my jobs and was unemployed. My kids got yelled at in the grocery store by someone who wanted them to know their father was destroying the country by not supporting the president. They would come home from school more than once in tears that someone had either said I was going to get killed or somebody's parents had declared that they hated me. We had to stop going to church because I kept getting yelled at by people in church. My wife was in a Bible study, and the day she told them that she had lung cancer, a lady told her that she would pray for her, but she also wanted to punch me in the face. It was a wild ride. So I'm dealing with all of these things, and I start thinking, if something really did happen to Christy and me, I would really want to make sure my children at the time were 11 and 8, and would want them to make sure they knew things. And I sat down to start writing this book and realized that I really wouldn't want them to know anything about politics. There wasn't a whole lot politically that I thought they needed to know. I needed them to know that their mother and I love them, that God is real, that if we do die, that they will have the opportunity to see us again if they believe certain things, and they needed all their favorite recipes, so that if I couldn't be there to make them the cinnamon rolls I make for them, they would be able to do it for themselves. So yeah, the last half of the book is a cookbook. And I should say, in fairness, that my kids are in this really super picky phase, and so they don't eat half the recipes at this moment. But they tell me to make them because they like the way they smell. So they do like the cinnamon rolls, though. I started writing this, and I want my kids to know about me. And what I realized in writing this book is that we as a society have begun developing communities of our own interest because of the internet. And I'm increasingly convinced that though I make my living on the internet, it's actually a bad thing. And we would be better off perhaps if we didn't have the internet, or at least we rethought how we use the internet. And the reason I mean that is I'm very fortunate where I live. We have made a point to know our neighbors. But I am shocked at how common it is to encounter people these days who do not know the person who lives next door to them in their apartment complex or next door to them on their street. That they have a lot of friends who all think the same thing, share the same things, and look the same in some capacity on the internet, but they don't know their actual community anymore. We have broken down the idea of our community, and our community is now what we create for ourselves as opposed to where we are placed. And to some degree, we all get to pick where we live, by and large. Some people don't, but most do. We get to pick the neighborhood we want to live in. But we've gone beyond that as a society now, where we're not just picking where we want our physical house, we're picking who we want as our friends on the internet. Some of whom we never actually meet in person, but we connect to them over the internet, and we all agree the same. We all get our news from the same sources. We all tend to think the same way, and it becomes suddenly very easy to think of the other people who aren't in our community as bad people. It becomes very easy there to begin to see them as the enemy. Well, they don't believe like me. They must be out to destroy the country. It becomes very easy for us to impute motives to someone else. Some of them do want to destroy the country, I'll say that, but a lot of them they have different ideas. They were raised a different way. They have a different background. And they're not the enemy. They're just people who disagree with us in politics. And I want my kids to actually know our next door neighbor. I want them to know their name. I want them to know their family. I want them to know when the walkers across the street are sick, and so that their mother and I can take food to them. I want them to know the people in their church. I want them to be surrounded with physical people. I was giving a speech last night in Montana with National Public Radio, and it hit me several weeks ago. I was listening to someone, and they asked the question, do you know the first negative thing that happens in the Bible? Where's the first no, the first not, the first bad? And Cain and Abel is what people last night said, and it's not. And it's not the serpent in the Garden of Eden either. It's not the biting of the forbidden fruit. It's actually in the Garden of Eden. Before evil is even entered into the world, God says it's not good for man to be alone. The loneliness is the first bad thing. And we now live in a society where people are lonely. They don't think they're lonely because they have a friend on the internet, but they don't have anybody to come sit at their kitchen table and break bread with them. They don't have anybody that they go out and see that they have a need to feel the need to take care of or to check on. It's all people on the internet, some of them halfway across the country or halfway around the world. And we've become a nation of lonely people who our friends are on the internet, who are never going to challenge us. We're never going to have to encounter a competing difficult idea because we've picked these friends who would agree with us on things. And I don't want that for my kids. We don't let our kids have Snapchat and Facebook and Twitter. Our oldest has an Instagram account that's private, and our entire family follows her, so if she ever does something crazy, we'll know about it immediately. Half the things she does aren't crazy, and we still know about it immediately. And I don't want for them kind of the life that I created in that regard, where most of my friends are people I met on the internet. As my wife now is battling cancer and I've been dealing with health issues, I've realized that even in our church, most of my friends have moved away for jobs, and I really have no social outlets in my community, and having to focus again on rebuilding that. Having those local social outlets are so important. Having your kids be willing to have community is important. And there are two aspects of community that I want them to know. One is we live in a world where I'm an evangelical Christian. I have certain beliefs. I want my kids to share those beliefs. I believe they are the means to salvation. And I want to surround my kids with people who share those beliefs, because increasingly the world says those are crazy things and nobody should believe those. And the world's not coming for me. The world's not coming for any of you. They're coming for our kids. They're trying to tell our kids that our ideas are crazy, outmoded, and no one should believe these things. And it's reflected in our culture. So I want my kids to be surrounded with people when they get into their teenage years and no longer listen to their mother and me. We'll have surrounded them with good people that reflect our values, and those are the people they will listen to. I remember growing up as a kid, I got to a point where I wouldn't listen to my parents, but all my parents' friends, I would listen to them, call them aunt and uncle when they weren't blood relations, but they were just part of the family. And still to this day, they're like surrogate parents. But there was a time where I would listen to them and not my parents, and they shared my parents' values. So I was still reflecting my parents' values. But there's this other sort of community as well that I think is necessary, and that is the people you want to be your friends. And I'm a strong believer in the fact that we get a lot of blessings in life. And that when we get these blessings, they're not for us to enjoy, but for us to share with others, for others to enjoy with us. We're not supposed to hoard our blessings. So we're supposed to bless other people with them. And we should be inviting people in to build community with us. People we want to be our friends that we don't know. We may know sort of, but invite them in around the table, break bread with them, learn to cook a meal if you don't cook. Fewer and fewer people in the world today do cook. So if you cook, it sets you apart. Invite people in to cook. That's one of the reasons the recipes are in the book. I need my children to have a strong community, because there will be a point where their mother's house does take a turn for the worse. And I will need support and they will need support. And there will be times where I'm busy dealing with my wife and they will need someone they can turn to. And building community that is a real physical, tactile community where we're not really alone, I think is something that we as an American society no longer really do and need to get back to. I'm also a real big believer in local community. I started several years ago going to seminary, and the main reason I went to seminary is on my radio show in Atlanta. I talk a lot about culture and faith, probably more than a radio show host should talk about culture and faith, but it's the South. I can get away with Jesus talk. And I started getting invited to fill in on Sundays for small Baptist churches. And I kept telling them all, no, it was very weird. I didn't go to seminary, so I shouldn't fill in for you. And at one point decided, maybe this is God's way of saying you should go to seminary. So I did. I went to Reformed Theological Seminary. I didn't realize there was a big issue between dispensationalists and Reformed. That's a whole separate subject. But when they found out I was going to Reformed Seminary, the invitation stopped. But I still kept going to seminary. I'm now working on my PhD in theology. And I spent a lot of time focusing, particularly, I love the prophets. I love their just rich portions of the Old Testament that I want my kids to understand the values from and the basis from. But one of the things I say all the time to people on the radio when I talk about these issues is that ultimately, I think we all have to do a little bit better job of reflecting our faith, and one of the incumbent parts of that we all forget is grace. And people don't show each other enough grace anymore, particularly because we've become so tribal. If you violate the norms of your tribe, you're thrown out of your tribe. There's no forgiveness there. If you're in the other tribe and do something that offends, and even if you apologize, well, it's just proof you're a terrible person. You can't be forgiven. And the worst trend of all on the internet, and I write about all the dumb things I've done on the internet, and there have been plenty. I venture to say that I am one of the few people in this room, if not the only person in this room, who's ever had the dumb things he's done on the front page of the New York Times. And I need my kids to know about those things because as their teachers have told me in their school, I'm the one parent in the entire school the kids are forbidden to Google when they learn what the internet is. So my kids are going to Google me. And they're going to find a lot of things that are true and a lot of things that aren't true. And they need to know what's true from me. And they need to understand that one of the worst traits of the internet now is that we are all anchored by the worst thing we've done. There are bad things I've done a decade ago, and people will still bring them up. You can't listen to this person, he said this. Never mind, it was 10 years ago. Never mind, he's apologized for it. This is defining the person. And we're starting to see this, that if we're defined by the worst thing we've ever done, and no one will allow us to move on from it or apologize for it, well, then what's the point of ever moving on? What's the point of ever growing up? What's the point of ever improving? Let's just be our worst selves. To paraphrase Joel Osteen, and I hate quoting him, let's have our worst life now. Let's be our worst self now. That's what the internet wants of us, and I think we have to actually strive to do better. And I want my kids to do better than me. I want them to do better than the people around me, than the people they see reflected in society. And I want them to know that there's going to be inordinate pressure for them to go along to get along. And usually when you're going along to get along, you're doing it badly. That you should do what's right and not what's liked. You should remember that there will be a last day. There will be a judgment. And you have the opportunity to be on the winning team. And all you have to do is have some belief, have some faith. And this past couple of years, struggling in faith has been a real challenge. It's been a whirlwind tour my wife and I have had these last couple of years. Going to seminary has been one of the great respites in my life, to have one day a week where I unplug and don't have to think about politics or the news, and just focus on higher, greater things. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been richly rewarding. And I'm reminded all the time of Amos, Amos has become my spirit animal. When I grew up, my very first memory really of anything in childhood is, the Golden Books. They had a Golden Books Bible, and it had these beautiful pictures. And Daniel in the Lion's Den is the first Bible story I remember. My grandmother read it to me, the Golden Books Bible. I can picture to this day in my head the painting of Daniel in the Lion's Den. And my grandmother reminded me that sometimes the lions are people who've always hated you, and sometimes the lions are people who really liked you up until the moment they surrounded you. And you've always got to be able to remember that you've got to do what's right, regardless of where the pressures come from. And I have the chair in which my grandmother read me that story, and as my kids were born, I sat in that same chair with that same book and read them that same story, to do what's right. And as I've gotten to seminary, I've moved from Daniel to Amos, who was this just fascinating guy who was not a professional prophet. And I never realized until I went to seminary that there actually were professional prophets, a class of prophets. Amos was a farmer, and God called him to go from Judah up to Israel and informed them that they were essentially doing it wrong, that they had fabricated their religion. It wasn't the right one, and that there was going to be a judgment. And they all told him, you know what, we're up here getting paid for this. You go get paid back down south. We don't need you up here cutting into our turf. They treated him terribly. And he wasn't very popular. He wasn't very popular in his own hometown because he was telling them they were going to be judged as well. But I think more and more we would be a whole lot better as a society if we had a lot more Amoses, a lot more people willing to say what needs to be said even if it's unpopular, a lot more people willing to speak truth even when people don't want to hear it, a lot more people who are willing to just stand up. One of my great pleasures in life is to have a radio show. I never intended to have a radio show. I literally was a lawyer and started working at CNN as a political commentator, and one day the local radio show host in my town, Macon, Georgia, got arrested in a crack house doing drugs, and they needed someone to fill in for him that day while he was getting out of jail. So they called and asked, because I had been on about a legal case, and one day turned into a week. And then the radio show host made the unfortunate mistake of saying he had fallen off the wagon, which wasn't the problem. It was the again after the I've fallen off the wagon. And they determined, oh, you've lied on your employment forms, we can fire you. So they did. So I worked for them for 3 months for no pay, getting up doing radio from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. every day. They paid me in an expired gift certificate to Outback Steakhouse. And while I was doing it, Herman Cain decided to run for president. And at the time I was running RedState.com, and the owner of the radio station in Atlanta where I work was a reader, heard that I was on the radio, listened, assumed that I actually had a radio career, and had his staff call and ask if I wanted to come take Herman Cain's job when he was running for president. And they had no idea, they literally had no idea I wasn't actually a radio show guy. I fell into it. My first week on the radio, we had an ice storm in Atlanta. I was doing radio 9 to midnight every day. There were no phones. It was just me talking nonstop. I realized that I actually can talk for a living. And I've been on radio ever since because a guy got arrested doing drugs. God puts you in strange places. Everything has been very providential. And my kids need to know all of these things in this book. And it's been weird. That's the only way. My wife and I use the word surreal a lot. And life is surreal. And I think to get us beyond the surrealness of life, we have to have real life. And real life is not on the internet. It's not in some faraway place, and it's not in Washington, D.C. I'll leave you with this. One of the pieces of scripture I quote in my book is Jeremiah, and I always get the verses wrong, but 29:7, seek the welfare of the city in which you're in exile, for there you will find your salvation. And the city where you are in exile isn't America. It's not the world. It's here. It's your local community. And we know that from the word choice used in the original. He wasn't Jeremiah wasn't talking about the Persian Empire. He was talking about the local community where you were going to be stuck as an exile. Look for the welfare of that place. And we have made Washington, D.C. an idol. It is the be-all, end-all. Everything comes from Washington, but the real solutions come from here. They come from your hometown. And if you don't know your neighbor and you don't know the problems of the homeless man down the street, if you don't know the local charities in your community who are doing local work, feeding the poor in your community, you're doing it wrong. We're all doing it wrong in that regard. I think our nation could solve many of the problems that divide us the most by letting people be themselves in their local community and doing it the way their local community wants. And guess what? If you don't like it, there are hundreds of thousands of other communities you can move to in this great land of ours. There's a community for all of us. We just have to find it. And what I do know is that that community is not the internet community. It's the physical, real city that we're supposed to live in and seek the welfare of so that we can find our welfare and our salvation. And as I leave here tonight and turn it over to questions, I will tell you that is more and more my focus in what I write and what I think and what I say is that we can't find all of our solutions in Washington, D.C. And we have become virulent political activists in this country because it's all about who controls Washington, D.C. And every fight must matter if it's about who controls Washington, D.C. But there are a lot of fights that shouldn't matter. As a man who very literally should be dead, I can tell you that in the grand scheme of things, as your life is passing before your eyes, politics isn't going to flash before your eyes. Your family and your community are. And that's where I think our heart and our time should be, seeking the welfare of the city in which we're in exile until we are called home to eternity, where I hope to see my kids again one day, and many of you as well. Thank you very much for having me this evening. Oh.
We've got a few minutes for questions for Eric, and if you would just raise your hand. We've got a few staff here with microphones. Just if you could wait till we put a microphone in your hand, that would be great. Do we have any questions?
I enjoyed your speaking very much.
Thank you.
And my question to you is, your parents were your role models. It seems like you went this way when maybe your parents were this way. Is that what happened? Because it seems like you're coming back to speaking about neighbors and friends that are not an internet. And my concern is the fact that so many young people, I consider you young in comparison to me.
Why, thank you.
That your generation seems to have gone askew from what we interacted. And we got that from our role models of our parents. So I'm asking you, how about your parents and you?
I had a very interesting childhood. And my wife says I was the victim of child abuse, and she means it lovingly. I mean, I grew up in Dubai. in the 1980s, where literally as long as I woke up and was present for school the next morning, my parents were okay if I was gone. I mean, I could show up at 4 a.m. and go to sleep for an hour and be up and ready for school, and it was okay. My dad worked offshore on an oil platform. He'd be gone a week and home a week. But they made sure that we experienced culture, and they made sure we experienced society. They made sure I experienced the world very literally. And they were willing to let us have adventure, which I think a lot of parents these days don't. You know, when I was 10 years old, my parents decided that it was okay for me to fly from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates to Baton Rouge, Louisiana by myself. When I was 10, the plane crashed. 747, we had to land in Innsbruck, Austria with no wheels on a foamed runway because the engines had caught on fire and shut down. And I missed my flight from Amsterdam to Atlanta. There was actually a Jehovah's Witness conference, and all the hotel rooms at the Schiphol Airport were filled up, so I got to stay in the red light district as a 10-year-old at a Holiday Inn, and was picked back up the next morning, flown to Atlanta in first class, and I do believe every person my parents knew on the eastern seaboard of the United States were there to make sure I still had all my fingers, all my toes, and everything else I was supposed to have, and picked up nothing along the way. And then made it to Baton Rouge. After that, my parents were like, you can go wherever you want to go whenever. And I started chauffeuring my sister around the world as we would come home. It was, to some degree, I benefited in my parents being hands-off. But I also benefited in that they made sure I was in church on Sunday. We didn't go to church overseas. It was an odd experience to try to go. But then they also made sure that I had certain values and had certain manners. I really do think my grandparents, my grandmother in particular, was vastly more influential on me than anyone. During the summers, we would come home for 3 months and stay with her. And there were many summers where I would come home alone and it would just be us for half a month. And my grandfather, who had had numerous strokes and was not quite there, but definitely my parents and my grandparents had some impact on me. And I think all parents do have impact on their kids. It's just, what is the impact these days? You know, the hardest thing actually is that I'm 42, and even people who are 10 years younger than me, none of us really grew up with the internet. And there was no manual. We had to figure it out ourselves. My kids have had the internet since the day where they were born. And they figured it out a different way. And I think to some degree, a lot of us have made mistakes along the way in how we do things like that. With the rise of a 24/7 news cycle and stuff that you didn't have as a kid, that my parents didn't have as a kid. There's something valuable, I think, about unplugging.
Right over here.
What is the greatest wisdom that you have learned that you would want to impart to your children, and possibly also to other young fathers who would also want to be an example to their children?
You know, so as I was writing this book along the way, I started writing down things that I wanted to make sure got into the book. And I got to the end of the book and realized I still had all of these things that weren't there. So the last chapter are just bullet points, just little things I want my kids to learn. You know, I think, honestly, the wisest thing that I think I know is to not presume I'm wise. And that my children should never presume that they know it all. I should never presume that I know it all. I think real wisdom comes at this point in my life from knowing you could be wrong and being willing to acknowledge that you could be wrong and learn new facts and explore whether or not you are wrong, instead of doubling down, which I have long had a tendency to do. The other great piece of wisdom that I give my kids is that no one understands the codes on the back of the laundry tags, and just throw it all in on delicate, on cold, and you'll be fine. That is actually, so when I was a kid, my parents were the host family for the Fifth Fleet in Dubai, and I decided to help them all out and wash all their clothes for them. I didn't realize you couldn't put reds in with other things, and the Navy at one point had a lot of sailors coming out of Dubai with pink uniforms because there was one red pair of pants in there. So I say that lightheartedly, but that is one of the bits of wisdom I leave to my kids is you don't need to learn the laundry tags, just wash it in cold on delicate and you should be fine.
Other questions?
Yes.
Right here.
Hi. How are your kids handling the news about your wife and you, for that matter, with the physical?
You know, unfortunately, so my wife, you should know, is 6 feet tall, has a shotgun, tattoos, and just bought herself a Harley. I'm not a fan of the tattoos or the Harley. But between the two of us, we have been both blessed with two great smartasses for children. I mean, they really are. They really are. We got a note home from school the other day that my 9-year-old had to explain the difference. But now you should know, we don't talk about politics in our house. I do it for a living. We don't talk about it at home. The kids kind of get it where they get it, and after 2016, they have very strongly held opinions about the president, which I wish they didn't have. But the teacher wrote home that my son was asked that he had to explain the difference between ignorance and stupidity in class. And he said, ignorance is not knowing something, and stupidity is knowing it and acting like you don't. And he had to give the example. And his example was, you can be ignorant and the president is stupid. Yeah, we had to have a talk. Yeah, you know, I'm a firm believer that our kids should actually support the president, whoever it is. You don't have to agree with his policies, but don't demean the office or the man. But my kids, they've got strongly held opinions that I hope are only loosely held, so that they have some flexibility to change them. As to the direct question, I say that just to give you their frame of mind. Our 12-year-old pays a little more attention. She's a 12-year-old headed into her teenage years and has basically become the drama queen. So she likes to hold on to the drama of what's going on. The 9-year-old, as long as you put him in front of a video game or give him a baseball, he's pretty much oblivious to everything else. And so we have them where they need to be. They know that something is wrong. My wife, this pill that she takes gives her very bizarre side effects. And as long as she has the side effects, it means the pill is working. So we're happy for her side effects. But one week she'll have a rash, and the next week she'll have what look like very painful blisters on her skin. The next week she can't sleep. The next week she can't wake up. Sometimes she has them all together. Sometimes her fingers crack open because her skin gets dry. And the kids have just kind of learned there is something wrong with mom, and we have to let her rest. My son loves baseball, and I promised that I would take him to all of his games and practices when baseball started. I've taken him to all the practices. I've taken him to half the games. She's not really a fan of baseball, so she was very happy when the Storms rolled through Georgia the other night and the game got canceled. But he knows that he's got to spend a little more time with me, and it's kind of, I didn't have a strong relationship with my dad until I got to college because he was gone all the time. And I'm gone a lot, but I work from home, including during the summer, which I got to rethink. And so my son spends a lot more time with me than I ever spent with my dad. And now that my wife gets worn out a lot, we definitely have a lot more father-son bonding time. And it's kind of scary for me, actually, just as an aside, that, you know, no one ever, you don't actually get an award or a medal like they did at the end of The Wizard of Oz, where one gets the diploma and one gets the heart and one just gets the badge. You don't actually get that when you get old. I mean, there's one day you just wake up and certain parts of your body don't work the way they used to, but no one actually, somebody calls you sir one day. I think the defining moment of when you've gotten old is that a 12-year-old and a 21-year-old look exactly alike. You can't really tell the difference between them. That's really, and I've gotten to that point. But no one just says one day that you're old or you're in charge, and one day you just look around the room and suddenly everyone's looking to you for advice. And it has dawned on me I've gotten to that point in my job and in my life that suddenly I actually am the boss and I'm in charge, and I can't be going and seeking someone else's opinion because everybody wants my opinion. And it scares me from the parental sense because I didn't have that relationship with my dad as a kid, if I'm doing this right or not. And I don't know that I am. I hope I don't screw up my kids. I think, though, that I take a camera everywhere I go now. And my wife, I got into cooking as a hobby. She decided I needed to become a photographer or we were going to get fat. So she gave me photography lessons, and I carry my camera everywhere I go now and take pictures. Didn't bring it today because I couldn't see. It was foggy and rainy, and suddenly it cleared out. But I go home and show them the pictures, and then I take my kids with me on trips more and more. While my wife rests, I'll take the kids to New York or Washington. And so they have a different upbringing than we expected to give them. But I think they're fairly well grounded at this point. And we've got another few years to keep building memories, and we try to travel every summer so that they have time with us while they can.
Other questions? Eric, I've got one that I just might, because we have time for one last question, I might throw at you. We spoke about this just briefly before you came on, and it ties to your topic about the internet, and it relates to a comment you recently made on your blog about this outrage over Facebook and the sharing of personal information. And I wonder if you'd comment on that in terms of how you feel about the value that people get by trading information, and whether or not people should be outraged over this recent incident of Facebook.
You know, and I try to leave the partisanship out when I talk about my book, but you know, everybody was okay when President Obama did the exact same thing in 2008 and 2012, and he actually did it with gusto. And there were numerous flattering articles about his campaign using Facebook data and psychograph. That was the first time I ever heard the word psychographic, was during the 2008 campaign, as the president was using that data from Facebook and Google and whatnot to target people. And it's the nature of the world we live in. None of you pay to use Google, Facebook, or Twitter. And the reason you don't pay to use it is because you are the product being sold. They are selling you to advertisers, and they make the data available to advertisers. I've gone on hiatus from Twitter because I don't find it edifying anymore. It used to be just me and my friends, and now it's every angry person in the world with an anonymous account yelling at me if I say the sky is blue. It's just not fun anymore. And it also brings out the worst in everybody, myself included, and I think it's bad for my sanctification, so I've given it up. And I rarely use Facebook because I really, you know, you have a right, I think, to keep in touch with people you grew up with, but you should also have a right to move on and not have to still be friends with the kid in first grade who ate boogers next to you. But Facebook seems to insist that you stay friends with these people. And I don't like it. I don't like being very public anymore. I used to. And I spend, for example, I'm having to resist myself, and I've already broken it largely because I wanted people to know I'd be out here. But my wife in particular is very insistent that I don't share on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook that I'm traveling anymore. After you have people show up at your house and have to have armed guards for months on end, it kind of freaks her out. So I do this flurry of I've been here last week. Here are the pictures from it. Sorry I didn't tell you that I was coming. But I can't be mad at Facebook and Google and Twitter for selling this data. It's what they do. It's the nature of their business. Full disclosure, I always feel like I should say I'm a Facebook shareholder. I bought it the first day. It's done very well, and I think it's probably time to sell now. But I don't like sharing that information. I do have to say, just as an aside, if you're doing a psychological profile quiz to pick you and your favorite Disney princess on Facebook, and they want all of your data, that's probably a big red flag that they really don't care which Disney princess you are. They really want to find out whether or not you're someone they can sell advertising to. And if more and more people realize that, maybe they would use these products less. Listen, it wouldn't be a bad thing. It would be a bad thing if we stopped sharing on Facebook and actually had somebody over for coffee at our house and shared with them instead. That would be a lot better.
Thanks, Eric. Well, with that, I think we're out of time. And Eric, I know you traveled a long way to come here. And on behalf of everyone in the audience, we're just so honored to have you here. And for all of you, if you haven't picked up a copy of Eric's book already, you can get it right over here. And I know he's going to be here for a few minutes afterwards to sign and say hello to each of you. So with that, thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you all very much.